Hercule Poirot and the Last Echo in the Empty Room. Chapter 1. The Last Echo. The storm raging over the Sussex cliffs seemed to reflect a much more intimate turmoil at the heart of the imposing Lichfield Manor. It was one of those residences that seemed built to hold secrets. Thick walls, dark stained-glass windows, carpets that muffled footsteps, and a music room that hadn't been used for years. Yet that night, the empty room echoed with a single sound. The echo of a piano note, abrupt, unfinished, as if the hand that played it had been stopped by something other than mistake. It was the butler, old Frobisher, who heard it from the hall. Entering the room with cautious steps, he found Mr. Alaric Montrose slumped beside the grand piano, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, a glass of brandy still trembling on the Persian rug. Frobisher didn't scream. He was a man who had served in the war and seen worse. But even he felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the strange detail. All the doors were locked from the inside, and there was not a soul in the room except for the dead man. The death of Alaric Montrose, former director of the National Conservatoire and renowned cultural benefactor, caused a stir in London social circles. He had been an eccentric but beloved man. Widowed for years, he lived with his younger sister Clarissa Montrose, a melancholic woman with a reputation as a frustrated pianist, his goddaughter, the brilliant and reserved young Isabel Vane, and a young protégé named Conrad Hale, a promising composer whom Alaric had mentored since his youth. Also present that evening were Dr. Emmerich Shaw, a close family friend and Alaric's personal physician, and Miss Daphne Rigby, a music critic feared for her reviews and known for her sharp tongue. All of them, for one reason or another, had gathered at the mansion under the pretext of a private dinner that, according to Alaric, would culminate in a revelation that would change their lives forever. The local police were quick to declare the death a possible suicide. There were no signs of a struggle, no visible wound, and no suspects at the scene. But Clarissa Montrose, her eyes glazed over from tears and suspicion, sent a desperate letter to a Parisian address. In it, she wrote just one line. "Monsieur Poirot, my brother would not have taken his own life, and the piano doesn't lie." 2 days later, under a grey sky that still seemed to carry the echoes of the storm, a taxi stopped in front of the mansion. A man with a compact figure, a meticulously manicured moustache, and a grey felt hat got out. Hercule Poirot, with his cane and small suitcase, walked toward the entrance like someone entering a theatre stage, already knowing the role he was to play. He was greeted by Clarissa, whose paleness contrasted with the sobriety of her black dress. Her voice trembled as she greeted him. "Monsieur Poirot, thank you for coming. The police think it was suicide. But I know, it was something more." "And what makes you think that, madame?" asked Poirot, slightly inclining his head, his eyes already scanning the hall, the portraits on the wall, the light dust in the corners. "My brother hadn't touched the piano in 5 years, since his wife died. But that night, someone forced him. Someone wanted that note to remain as a message." Poirot narrowed his eyes. "And what note was it?" "F sharp. A single note, sharp, and then nothing." Poirot didn't reply immediately. He took a few steps towards the living room, still cordoned off by the police, and said softly, "Sometimes, madame, the silence after a note is more eloquent than the note itself." He turned to her, his expression sharper than ever. "Well, it's time to make this house talk, because I, Hercule Poirot, promise you the last echo in this empty room will not be ignored." Chapter 2. A Circle of Secrets. Lichfield Mansion, despite its splendour, had a restrained air, as if even the walls knew how to remain silent. Poirot, with measured steps and no hurry, was welcomed into the main hall by the residents and visitors still present after the tragic event. His presence caused a mixture of relief and suspicion, as if some felt that the search for the truth would uncover something they had long hidden. Clarissa Montrose, with a sharp face and eyes that betrayed sleepless nights, made the introductions with a tremulous voice. "Monsieur Poirot, may I present Isabelle Vane, my niece, or rather, Alaric's goddaughter?" The young woman bowed slightly, her fingers clasped tightly in her lap. "Conrad Hale, our young composer." Monsieur Alaric considered him a son. Conrad, with a nervous demeanour and pale cheeks, shook Poirot's hand without enthusiasm. His eyes were those of someone who felt constantly watched. Dr. Emmerich Shaw, a close family friend and my brother's personal physician. And lastly, Miss Daphne Rigby. The woman in question, elegant of indeterminate age, with red lips and a critical gaze, neither stood up nor did she bother to hide her discomfort. "Monsieur Poirot, is it really necessary to continue stirring the mud of a death that has already been explained?" Poirot looked at her with a slight smile. "Mud, madame, is only annoying if you have something to hide under it." A low, polite murmur followed the comment. Poirot seemed to have come not to investigate, but to study a play. His eyes moved with surgical precision. A wrinkle in Isabelle's skirt, the slight tremor in Conrad's hand as he adjusted his glasses, the way Dr. Shaw avoided looking directly at Clarissa. "Perhaps we could have a better conversation in private," suggested Poirot. "Please, could each of you give me a few minutes separately? We'll begin with you, Mademoiselle Isabelle, if you don't mind." The young woman stood up, and as Poirot led her toward the library, the others fell silent. It was a dense silence, heavy with all that was left unsaid. Interview with Isabelle Vane. "My uncle was complex," Isabelle said, sitting opposite Poirot, her eyes avoiding his. "Generous, yes, but always testing others. He liked to be in control, even of other people's feelings." "And did he have enemies, musically or personally?" Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Is there a difference?" She smiled weakly. "Not with him. It was all a game, a kind of eternal rehearsal for a play only he knew. But that also made him vulnerable. Would you say that someone had reason to want him dead?" A silence. "Then I wouldn't say that, but someone might have felt cornered." Interview. With Conrad Hale, the young man became more agitated. "Me? Suspect? Please, Alaric gave me everything. My education, my career, my name. I wouldn't do anything that would play the piano." Conrad froze. What do you mean?" A single note was played before his death. F sharp. "Does that mean anything to you? F sharp," he repeated slowly, as if recognizing a hidden melody behind the question. It was his note, the one he used as a base to compose whenever he started something new, as if he was searching for order amidst chaos. Poirot nodded. He said no more. Interview with Dr. Shaw. He saw it as suicide, the doctor said, crossing his legs. The circumstances support that, and Alaric had bouts of deep melancholy. He even consulted me a few months ago. He talked about the end of his usefulness. Didn't it seem strange to you that he locked himself in a room he hadn't been in for years? Alaric was unpredictable, and the physical signs? Any concrete clues? Shaw tensed slightly. None. The body was intact. The brandy glass was empty, but there were no obvious signs of poisoning. The most likely cause, brain aneurysm. Quick death. Painless. And you were the first to touch the body? No. Frobisher was the one who found it. I arrived minutes later. Interview with Daphne Rigby. I hated him. Of course I did, the music critic said, not bothering to soften her tone. He was a cultural tyrant. He ruined careers on a whim. I never said it publicly, but I considered him a coward with a god complex. And you still accepted the invitation. Because he told me he wanted to reconcile. That he wanted to confess something. What kind of confession? I don't know. He didn't say anything, but he seemed serious. That's why I came, Poirot leaned towards her. And did you notice anything strange that night? She held his gaze. I noticed everyone was lying, including you right now, Monsieur Poirot. You're pretending to seek a truth that perhaps no one wants to know. When Poirot retired to his room that night, he lit his travel lamp and spread out his notebook. He drew a diagram of relationships, including names and gestures. A note, an echo, a death without violence, and a closed room. It's a very interesting problem. His fingers rested on a line, F sharp, and beside it he wrote 2 words, emotional motive. Because something or someone had made the past, like a badly resolved chord, return to sound one last time. Chapter 3. Closed doors and warm brandy. The next morning dawned shrouded in a thick fog that seemed to refuse to free Lichfield Manor from its atmosphere of suspicion. Poirot, impeccably dressed since before breakfast, walked through the corridors with the serenity of someone who listens more than he appears to hear. The butler, Frobisher, with his bygone manner, led him back to the music room, now free of the police seal. As you see, monsieur, nothing has been touched since the night of the incident, he said in a grave voice, opening the door with his key. Poirot nodded. He moved forward with gentle steps, as if afraid of disturbing the silence. His eyes scanned the piano, the empty glass on the carpet, the barely moved stool. Then he looked at the doors, one leading to the hall, another to the inner gallery. Both, according to the testimony, had been locked from the inside when Frobisher found the body. "Who has the keys to this room?" asked Poirot, without looking at the butler. "Just Mr. Montrose, me, and Miss Clarissa, in case of emergency. And no one else, not that I know of." Poirot touched the piano's surface, clean and shiny. Only a faint fingerprint on the lid. His own, perhaps. He gently opened the keyboard lid and examined the keys. F sharp was slightly depressed, as if it had been pressed harder than the others. "Has this piano been tuned recently?" "Last month, sir." Mr. Montrose demanded regular maintenance, even though I didn't touch him. Poirot smiled almost melancholy. "Ah, yes, true musicians never abandon their instruments. They just punish it with silence." The detective walked over to the glass. He lifted it with his handkerchief and sniffed it delicately. Then he put it back. "Was the brandy lukewarm when you arrived, Monsieur Frobisher?" "I couldn't say for sure. I was in shock, monsieur." But the glass didn't break, nor was there any spillage. It fell cleanly and without violence. That's how it was. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Where exactly were everyone present at the time of the discovery? Miss Isabel was on the veranda. She said she heard the note. Young Hale was in his adjoining study. Miss Rigby was on the terrace, and Dr. Shaw, in his room, preparing some medicine for Mr. Montrose. They all arrived after I gave the alarm. "Et Madame Clarissa?" "In her bedroom." Miss Vane came up to look for her, after hearing the scream. Poirot stopped in front of the window, where the fogged-up glass filtered the light in opaque beams. "And you? Where were you when you heard the note?" "Right in the hall, walking toward the kitchen. That's why I heard it so clearly." Poirot turned, staring at the butler. "Was it common for Mr. Montrose to drink alone in this room?" "No, monsieur. That room was almost sacred to him. He hadn't entered it since his wife died, at least not that I know of." Poirot frowned. His thoughts, sharp as scalpels, were beginning to draw the first lines of a logical structure. "Very well, sir. I appreciate your patience." Frobisher bowed and withdrew. Poirot was left alone. He allowed himself a few more minutes, observing the arrangement of objects, the paintings, even the acoustics of the room. Then he left resolutely. In the dining room, Clarissa and Dr. Shaw were conversing in low voices. Poirot entered unannounced. "Madame Montrose," he said softly, "I'd like to show you something. May I have a few more minutes in the music room?" "Of course, Monsieur Poirot. Is this a clue?" "Maybe. Or maybe just another echo." They both returned to the living room. Poirot indicated to Clarissa that she should sit in front of the piano. She hesitated. "I haven't been in years." "Just one note, madame." F sharp. With trembling fingers she pressed the key. A sharp, clear sound filled the room, echoing off the walls like a call. "Thank you. Now listen carefully." Poirot walked to the centre of the room, closed his eyes, and remained motionless. The echo lasted only a few seconds, but as it dissipated, it didn't return. "And yet," murmured Poirot, "someone heard him from the hall, or so he says." Clarissa looked at him, astonished. "Are you implying that—" "I'm suggesting that sound doesn't travel the same way if a door is closed, and according to your testimony, madam, all of them were." Clarissa's face paled. Perrault, Frobisher. Perhaps the butler was sincere, or perhaps not. What intrigues me, madam, is not so much the sound, but what came afterward. Why did someone want us to believe your brother played that note? But if he hadn't been in here for years, why would he have returned that very night? Poirot kept silence. Then he added, "The answer, madam, lies in the silence that followed, because everything that wasn't said is hidden there." Chapter 4. The Unexpected Testament. On the 4th day after Alaric Montrose's death, Lichfield Manor witnessed another tense meeting, albeit of a different nature. The atmosphere was one of restrained anticipation, where faces seemed more strained by what was about to be said than by what was already known. The family notary, Mr. Elwyn Hargrave, had arrived from Brighton with the will in a brown leather folder, and with it a new chapter in the mystery unfolded. Poirot, though not formally invited, was invited to attend the reading. He sat with his back straight, his moustache perfectly aligned, and his eyes like obsidian buttons, recording every gesture, every held breath. The will was last updated exactly 4 months ago, Hargrave announced, polishing his glasses leisurely. Mr. Montrose insisted on strict confidentiality until his death, as was his style. Those present, Clarissa, Isabel, Conrad Hale, Dr. Shaw, and Miss Rigby, looked at each other with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. Daphne, with a sly smile, whispered, "This promises to be more entertaining than many modern operas." Elwyn Hargrave opened the document and began to read in a solemn voice. "I, Alaric Montrose, of sound mind and without duress of any kind, declare the following." The initial provisions surprised no one. Modest bequests to domestic staff, donations to musical institutions, and finally, what had everyone expected? I leave my entire estate, including Lichfield Manor, my accounts and my unpublished works, to Miss Isabel Vane, under one condition. A murmur ran through the room. Isabel, visibly surprised, paled. That said inheritance may not be transferred, sold, or altered for the next 5 years. During that time you must reside in the mansion and preserve intact the collection of personal sheet music housed in the study in the West Wing. Conrad Hale rose from his seat. "What? That doesn't make sense. He promised me." "Mr. Hale," the notary interrupted without looking up. "If you wish to interrupt, I will record it in the minutes." Poirot, meanwhile, wasn't looking at the notary. He was observing Isabel. Her reaction had been genuine, not joy, but a weight falling upon her. Then he turned his eyes to Clarissa, who maintained her composure with a barely altered expression. Hargrave continued, "To Clarissa Montrose, my sister, I leave a lifetime sum and a guarantee of her continued ownership of the mansion for as long as she lives, provided she does not interfere with the beneficiary's decisions. To Conrad Hale, I regret to say that my hopes were disappointed. What I offered was neither obeyed nor respected. I leave you my pocket watch, a symbol of lost time." Vidieux, icy silence fell over the room, and to Dr. Emmerich Shaw, nothing, because whoever knows the truth and doesn't tell it is also a betrayer. The notary closed the will without another word. The echo of the last lines seemed to linger in the air, as if Alaric's spirit still hovered, savouring the impact of his words. An hour later, Poirot was strolling through the gardens when he was caught up with Isabel. She was wrapped in a woolen jacket that seemed too big for her. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I knew nothing of this. I had no idea that he—" "Mademoiselle, would you have preferred the inheritance to go to someone else?" "It's not that. It's just, this isn't a gift. It's a warning. My uncle never did anything without purpose." Poirot nodded. "You're more observant than others think. Your uncle liked you, no doubt. but he also tested you. Do you think this has anything to do with his death? Certainly, mademoiselle. The content of the will, especially that 5-year clause, suggests that Mr. Montrose feared for your works, or for you, and the watch, for Mr. Hale, is not an object. It is an accusation in the form of a metaphor. And what about Dr. Shaw? Ah, that's fascinating. To tell him that he knows the truth and isn't telling it implies that Montrose knew something was coming, or that someone had betrayed a confidence. Isabel looked down. And what will you do now? Poirot gave a subtle smile. I'm going to speak to each of them again. Only this time I won't ask questions. I'll just observe how they respond to the new balance on the board. A crime, mademoiselle, is like a symphony. But the will, that's the change in tone. That evening, Poirot didn't dine with the others. He stayed in the library with tea and his notebook. He made the following note. Isabel inherits unintentionally. Clarissa remains, but without control. Hale, betrayed, resentful. Shaw, accused of silence. Rigby, spectator, or something more. And on the last line he wrote, who played F sharp, knowing he wasn't supposed to play anything. Chapter 5. The Shadow Composer. The next morning found Poirot in his natural state, calm, surrounded by order, and in full mental activity. He was sitting in the study in the west wing, the same one where, according to the will, Alaric Montrose's personal scores were kept. Frobisher, always punctual and silent, had handed over the key with a slight trembling in his hands. Mr. Montrose came here alone. He didn't allow anyone to touch his manuscripts, the butler said, before leaving cautiously. Poirot closed the door behind him and paused for a moment. The place smelled of aged paper and varnish. There were shelves lined with bound sheet music, loose notes and leather notebooks. A large window let in natural light, illuminating a desk piled high with objects in perfect symmetry. A quill pen, a clock stopped at 11:42, an open score, and a small piece of paper folded beneath it. Poirot delicately extracted it. Music must end where it began. Only then does it reveal its truth. A sentence handwritten in Alaric's angular handwriting. Poirot raised an eyebrow and sat down. He examined the score. It was a study in F-sharp minor, incomplete. The last bars were abruptly cut off, as if the composer had left the piece mid-thought. However, what intrigued Poirot wasn't the melody, but a small pencil correction in the corner. Don't let Hale see it. Poirot leaned back slightly, crossing his fingers. The protected composer, the beloved pupil, had he been excluded from a final work? A soft knock at the door interrupted. Him. It was Isabel. Excuse me, sir. Frobisher told me you were here. May I come in? Of course, mademoiselle. It's your inheritance, after all. He walked in slowly, as if the place intimidated rather than impressed him. He approached the desk. My uncle used to say this room was his confessional, that he spoke to God here, or to his own demons. Poirot showed him the piece of paper. Do you recognize this phrase? She read and nodded. Yes, he said it often. For him, a composition wasn't just music. It was truth, revealed through order. And you knew that Conrad was forbidden to see this score? Isabel froze. No, but I'm not surprised. They'd been arguing a lot lately. Conrad insisted on modernizing my uncle's pieces, making them more commercial. My uncle considered it a betrayal. Poirot stood up slowly. Where is Mr. Hale now? In the greenhouse, with Daphne. Arguing. Well, she eggs. He nods. Poirot smiled briefly. Thank you, mademoiselle. It's been very helpful. The greenhouse, warm and scented with blooming lilies, contrasted with the tension in the air. Daphne Rigby stood, gesticulating with a glass of wine in her hand. Conrad Hale sat, staring at a plant as if he could hide inside it. And now, it turns out he won't even let him have his music. Not even that. See? Daphne said. Alaric got his revenge even after he was dead, like the great egotists. Conrad raised his eyes as Poirot approached. Monsieur Poirot, I didn't expect the music to outlive you, did you, Mr. Hale? Daphne raised an eyebrow. Oh, is this getting interesting? Poirot ignored the interruption. There's an unfinished piece in the study. Your name is crossed out in the corner. Did you know about it? Conrad pressed his lips together. No, but I'm not surprised, Alaric. He feared me. Were you afraid of his talent? I feared I might surpass him, that his legacy would be overshadowed. I idolized him, Monsieur Poirot, but I also defied him. Does that make him a murderer? Not necessarily, but yes, in someone with motives and mixed emotions. Poirot paused, then added, The note in F sharp. Did you play it? Conrad fell silent. Daphne slowly turned her head toward him. No, he finally said, but I would have liked to. That note was his trademark. Playing F sharp was like waking a ghost. Only he had permission. Maybe someone else did it, to make it seem like his ghost had awakened. Poirot returned to his room. In his notebook, he wrote in firm handwriting. Conrad, displaced but resentful. The piece, suppressed. Note played, symbol, not coincidence. Music, the language of the murderer. And below, a single line. A silent crime, but precisely composed. Poirot closed the notebook, his eyes shining with determination. The killer didn't need a weapon. Just a note, and a perfectly staged scene. Chapter 6. A Secret in a Miner. Key. At dusk, Lichfield Manor seemed even quieter, as if the walls were closing in on themselves to conceal what they knew. Poirot, after a dinner he barely touched, requested permission to examine Alaric Montrose's bedroom. Clarissa agreed with a mixture of resignation and regret. The bedroom was spacious, with a Victorian bed covered with a dark green velvet spread. Everything was in its place. The tidy dressing table, the books on their shelves, a dressing gown hanging on the coat rack. However, Poirot went directly to the bedside table. He opened the drawer. There, amidst some papers and a neatly folded handkerchief, he found a notebook of musical notations and a sealed envelope. He took it carefully. On the cover of the notebook, written in black ink, it read, Motifs in minor key for personal use. Inside, however, there were no scores, only phrases, reflections, truncated thoughts. Isabel is afraid of high notes. Clarissa avoids the east wing. Hale wants what he cannot understand. Shaw hears more than he admits. What if silence is the only confession? Poirot closed the notebook. It wasn't a musical notebook. It was a psychological record. The envelope was addressed to the notary, Elwyn Hargrave. No return address, no stamp. He opened it with great care. Inside, a folded piece of paper with a short line. If anything happens to me, look in the bottom of the cello case. Poirot let out a small "ah" of satisfaction. He left the room in search of the aforementioned object. He soon found it in the music room, an antique cello leaning against the wall next to the piano. The case, lined with maroon velvet, seemed intact. Upon examining the back of the case, beneath the padding, he found a false wooden bottom. With a tool borrowed from Frobisher, he managed to lift it. There, carefully rolled up, he found several documents, private correspondence, a letter signed by Daphne Rigby, harshly criticising a previously unpublished work by Alaric, a receipt for the purchase of barbiturates in the name of Dr. Shaw, and most intriguingly, a letter in Clarissa's own handwriting. "Brother, don't force me. The will is unfair. If you take everything from me, you leave me no choice." Poirot didn't allow himself an immediate reaction. Instead, he sorted each piece of paper by date. Clarissa's letter was barely 3 weeks old. He packed everything carefully and retired to the library, where, to his surprise, he found Clarissa already installed by the fire. "Have you discovered anything else, monsieur Poirot?" he asked in his calm voice, but with his eyes too alert. "A bit of everything, madam. This case has a melody of its own, sometimes soft, sometimes dissonant. I wonder, for example, why it's never been mentioned that your brother was on prescription drugs." Clarissa looked down. "He had anxiety, headaches. Dr. Shaw prescribed just the right amount. And did you know that your brother was planning to revise the will again?" She looked up slowly. "Are you talking about the change in favour of Isabel?" "I say this because I found a letter from you, madam. Very direct. Were you willing to do whatever it takes?" Clarissa tensed. For a moment she seemed to speak, but stopped herself. Then, in a low voice, "I just wanted justice. That girl, she's not his blood. And yet he treated her like an heiress, while you were reduced to a guest in your own home." She didn't reply. Poirot bowed his head. "Madam, I assure you I'm not seeking unnecessary scandal, but when a man like Alaric, so obsessed with order, dies seemingly naturally in a closed room, after leaving traces of conflict behind, one suspects the chaos has been carefully engineered. And you think I think your brother knew. The truth would reveal itself, like a note held too long. That's why he left traces, not physical evidence, not psychological traces, the kind that don't easily fade." That night Poirot wrote in his notebook, "Clarissa, reason for loss Rigby, silenced criticism. Shaw, provider of more than just advice. Isabel, witness who doesn't know what she saw. Hale, musician without a score, and in the centre, the echo, and below, with a firm stroke." The crime was committed in silence, and only a musical mind would understand how to fine-tune the exact moment. Poirot gently closed the notebook. Good. The notes are set. The beat is marked. Soon the truth will play its final chord. Chapter 7. The Variation Nobody Heard. By dawn, the fog over Lichfield Manor had dissipated, but not the opacity surrounding Alaric Montrose's death. Poirot, dressed in his trademark light grey suit, came down to breakfast with Swiss punctuality. The dining room was almost empty, except for Isabel, who was silently leafing through a Rilke book, her eyes fixed on the same page for some time. "Mademoiselle," Poirot greeted, sitting opposite her. "Sleep badly, eh?" She looked up, surprised by the tenderness implicit in her interlocutor's tone. "How do you know? Your teacup is untouched, but you've turned it 3 times on your saucer. That's what you do when you're restless. Also, you've underlined the same line twice. He who looks within awakens. Quite revealing, don't you think?" Isabel looked away. "Monsieur Poirot, do you think my uncle knew he was going to die? I think he knew someone wanted him dead. And like the meticulous composer he was, he decided to write his last work with notes that weren't on the staff. He left traces on papers, in gestures, in looks, and above all, in what wasn't said. And me? What do I leave behind? Your silence, mademoiselle, is a form of compassion, but even that can sound like complicity if it's not understood in time." Isabel bit her lip. "There's something I didn't tell you. A conversation, the night before he died. My uncle called me to his study. He asked me to read a poem he'd written. It was strange. It didn't rhyme. It had no form, but it spoke of betrayal, of a home without music, of an ending with stolen notes. And what did you do? He asked me to destroy it, but I didn't. It's hidden between the pages of a volume of Chopin in the library." Poirot stood up immediately. "Mademoiselle, you did the right thing by telling us. Come on, let's get it back." In the library, the morning sun entered with timid insistence through the windows. Isabel searched among the shelves until she found a worn volume with the score of the Ballads B, Chopin. From among its pages, he extracted a folded piece of paper with shaky handwriting. Poirot read it silently. "They stole my opening chord. They have returned it to me, transfigured like a son with another surname. Death is the perfect variation. It runs only once, and the final silence is irreversible." The detective let out a slight sigh. More confessional than musical. His uncle knew someone was betraying him, but he didn't know how to deal with it. Do you think he thought they would kill him? I don't rule it out. But even more so, I think he feared being symbolically silenced. His music altered. His legacy used as someone else's instrument. At that moment, the library door opened. Daphne Rigby strode in, a glass of port in her hand, despite the hour. "Ah, there you are, looking for inspiration among dusty ghosts." Poirot approached her slowly. "Auntie to the music room." It had been sealed off by the police, but with a word to the local inspector, he gained access. Inside, in the dimness of the soundproof room, he flipped through the reels, and there it was, a tape labelled with a single word. F.A. Poirot placed it in the recorder and turned it on. A pure, solitary note, sustained beyond natural range. A sharp F, clear and cold. Poirot smiled, not with triumph, but with certainty. So, the killer wanted too that the note would be heard, but I didn't want to be there when that happened, because if the note was recorded, then the room was empty when it played, and the crime had already been committed. Chapter 8. Time Decomposed. The key revelation of the tape marked a silent but irreversible change in the score of the case. Poirot, with his usual composure, didn't rush through the corridors or raise his voice. Instead, he simply stuffed the tape labelled F. Frit into his black leather briefcase and left the recording studio like someone picking up a nail from the floor to repair a chair that has waited decades. In the main hall, he found Frobisher rearranging some portraits on the mantelpiece. "Monsieur Frobisher," said Poirot, "I need to confirm something. Did Mr. Montrose make a habit of recording his compositions?" The butler turned slowly. "Yes, sir. He installed that equipment last year. He said memory was a traitor, and he preferred to rely on magnetic tape. And who else had access to that room? Just him, and occasionally young Hale, to help him adjust the sound levels. Although lately he'd been forbidden to do so." "Forbidden?" Mr. Montrose said that Conrad manipulated the tone of the recordings, that he wanted to modernize even the fidelity of the sound. Poirot nodded slightly, satisfied. Then, without delay, he asked everyone to gather in the blue drawing-room. Within minutes, Clarissa, Isabel, Conrad, Dr. Shaw, and Daphne Rigby were seated opposite Poirot, their faces reflecting various forms of tension, anxiety, annoyance, bewilderment, or fear. Poirot walked ahead of them, his hands clasped behind his back. "My friends, the crime in question is, without a doubt, one of the most silent I've ever encountered. And yet it was orchestrated with the precision of a symphony. Every beat, every silence, every pause, calculated to the second." Conrad Hale shifted in his seat. "Are you suggesting it was murder? You haven't proven anything yet." "Ah, Mr. Hale." "Not yet, but almost. You see, the crux of this case is one note, a single note, F-sharp, the one heard from the hall, but no one saw played, the one that became the final seal on Alaric Montrose's life." Poirot bowed slightly to all of them. "But that note wasn't played by human fingers. It was played back, from a recording, a tape with that single note, sustained and pure, placed in the adjacent studio, activated by a timer. What you heard wasn't live music. It was a pre-recorded echo. A murmur ran through the room." "What does that prove?" Daphne Rigby asked. "Couldn't it have been some kind of artistic message from Alaric?" "No, madam, because the timer wasn't programmed by him. It was set to go off minutes after his death. The real crime had already been committed by the time you all heard the note." Poirot turned to Dr. Shaw. "Doctor, you indicated there were no signs of violence, and yet a preliminary toxicology report, requested in advance by Poirot from the local police, revealed traces of ethyl morphine in the brandy glass, not in an immediately lethal dose, but in combination with an anticoagulant medication you prescribed." Shaw tensed. "That is a very serious accusation. Serious, but logical. You knew what medication he was taking, and you knew which substance, in small doses, could cause a subtle cerebral hemorrhage, undetectable to the naked eye. The aneurysm, doctor, wasn't spontaneous. It was induced." Clarissa closed her eyes, as if this revelation freed her from something she'd been afraid to confirm. Isabel, on the other hand, broke the silence. "But why? Why would Dr. Shaw do something like that? Poirot raised a finger. Ah, but that's the most important question. Motive. The doctor had no apparent motive, until we found a series of documents at the bottom of the cello case, including a promissory note. Mr. Montrose discovered that Shaw had been manipulating medical bills, charging for unadministered treatments, even selling prescriptions. He confronted him. He was going to turn him over to the authorities. Poirot approached the doctor, who was no longer hiding the sweat on his forehead. And instead of accepting his downfall, you found a solution. You killed him silently, without violence, without marks. Then you installed the recording to create an audio alibi. You made it seem like the death occurred at another time. But you forgot one thing, monsieur. Poirot opened his notebook and pointed to a line. The tape was labelled in French. F aim, not F fix, as it would be written in English notation. Only someone with European classical training, like Dr. Shaw, who trained in Switzerland, would have written the note like that. Shaw, pale as marble, sank into his seat. No one spoke. Finally, in a barely audible voice, the doctor said, "He humiliated me. He blackmailed me for weeks. I couldn't lose everything. Not again." Poirot nodded gravely. "Desperation, monsieur, never makes good decisions. The police were called." Shaw offered no resistance. Clarissa burst into silent tears. Isabel took Poirot's hand, grateful. Conrad, for the first time, said nothing. That evening, Poirot retired to Montrose's study. He turned on the gramophone. He played a piece in F-sharp minor, a false note, placed just in time to make everything seem harmonious. But you can't fool someone who listens with their heart, not just their ears. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he heard the last echo in the empty room. Chapter 9. The Legacy That Could Not Be Stolen. With Dr. Shaw's arrest, Lichfield Manor fell into a different kind of silence. It was no longer the silence of the unspoken, but of something beginning to be understood, as if, after the final chord of a symphony, each member of the orchestra released the breath they had held throughout the performance. Poirot, however, did not consider the case closed. He had learned that legal justice and emotional justice rarely met on the same staff. So that afternoon he decided to speak with Isabel alone in the garden, where the golden leaves were beginning to shed with the arrival of autumn. "How are you feeling, mademoiselle?" As if a bandage had been removed that I had been wearing for so long that I had forgotten I had it. "And yet you still have one question," said Poirot, sitting down beside her on the stone bench. "Why did he leave everything to me? Why not Clarissa? Why not just dissolve everything and donate his works?" Poirot took his walking stick, placed it gently between his knees, and answered in a calm voice. "Because your uncle was a man of enormous ego, and at the same time of profound love. His musical legacy wasn't just art. It was a statement. In you, he saw not an air of blood, but of sensitivity. He feared that Clarissa, in her resentment, and Conrad, in his ambition, would destroy the order he had built." Isabel looked down. "What if I'm not worthy of that? Ah, mademoiselle, humility is a more powerful sign of merit than vanity. Your hesitation shows that you are more prepared than you think. But Do you think my uncle knew Shaw would try to kill him? I think he suspected it. That's why he left traces like breadcrumbs for a mind that knew how to put them together. His poem, his notebook, the unfinished score, even the recording. They weren't just warnings, they were cries for help disguised as structure. Isabel was silent for a moment. He used to say that the truth always comes in the third bar. And he was right. A lie can maintain the first beat, and doubt can sustain the second. But the third beat, that's where the imbalance always comes in. And that's where the little grey cells find their harmony. That evening, Poirot asked all the mansions, residents and associates, to gather in the music room one last time. The atmosphere was lighter, but charged with an almost ritualistic introspection. Clarissa, still reeling from the revelation of the letter she'd written that had been exposed, remained distant. Conrad Hale avoided everyone's gaze. Daphne Rigby sipped wine, as if the quiet music in the room were more worthy than any symphony. Poirot spoke standing up, his expression serious but not harsh. The crime was solved, mes amis, but its echoes linger in this house. That's why I want you to hear something. Something that isn't proof or evidence, but a farewell. He walked over to the tape recorder, put in a different reel, labelled by himself as Adagio Final, and pressed play. A slow melody in F-sharp minor began to fill the room. But it wasn't Alaric's work. It was a mixture. Part his unfinished piece, part Poirot's reconstruction with the help of a score annotated by Isabel. The music spoke for itself. It began with tension, with notes that didn't resolve, and then slowly made its way toward a harmony that wasn't sweet, but true. A restrained, honest resolution. When he finished, Poirot said, "Music can be used to lie, as it was on the night of its author's death, but it can also purify the false and reveal the authentic. This piece represents not only what Alaric left unfinished, but what he unwittingly entrusted to you to complete." Clarissa wept silently. Conrad Hale, visibly moved, stood up and left without a word. Daphne, for the first time, remained silent. Later, Poirot was packing his suitcase. Isabel met him in the hall. "Is it going, sir?" "Oui, mademoiselle. My work here is done. But yours is just beginning." She offered him a small box. "I found this at the bottom of the shelf in the study. It's not important. Just an old baton." Poirot took it with a smile. A broken baton may no longer conduct orchestre, but it preserves the form of the gesture, like memory, when it's faithful. He bowed. "Goodbye, mademoiselle. May your music not just be a legacy, but a choice." And with that, Hercule Poirot, the man with the tireless grey cells, left Lichfield Manor, leaving behind a symphony that had finally reached its final chord. Chapter 10. The Silence That Spoke the Truth. 2 weeks had passed since Hercule Poirot left Lichfield Manor. The autumn leaves fell patiently in the garden, as if the house were finally breathing a new, cleaner, lighter air. However, the aftermath of the crime still resonated, not as screams, but as echoes, soft, persistent, and difficult to ignore. Isabel Vane had decided to stay. Not because the inheritance enticed her, In fact, she hadn't even touched the accounts yet, but because she felt a kind of debt to the history she'd been bequeathed, she spent hours in the West Wing study, sorting through scores, cataloguing manuscripts, listening to the unfinished recordings her godfather had left behind. Some were just fragments of scales. Others were vivid memories, small voice memos in which Alaric murmured ideas, corrected structures, laughed at his own mistakes. One of those recordings changed something forever. Isabel, if you're hearing this, I assume I'm gone. Don't take this too seriously. I just want to tell you that I've been a stubborn, egotistical, and complicated man, but also someone who believed that art shouldn't die in the wrong hands. If you're there, it means I didn't completely fail. Forgive me for what I couldn't give you, and thank you for what you never asked for. Isabel didn't cry when she heard it, but she closed her eyes and let the silence that followed speak for itself. Clarissa Montrose, for her part, had retreated to the south wing of the house. Since confessing to her threatening letter and her unexpected exclusion from the will, she had adopted a resigned, almost monastic attitude. She never touched the piano again. Nor did she exchange a word with Conrad Hale. While she hadn't been an accomplice to the crime, something in her expression suggested she carried guilt within her, even if it wasn't punishable by law. One afternoon, Isabel found her sitting in the greenhouse, gently stroking the leaves of a fern. "Do you want something, Aunt Clarissa? Just shadow. It's the only thing that doesn't weigh anything. He left a letter for me. It didn't mention you, but it did talk about being forgiven." Clarissa sighed. She was right, not to confide her end to me. And yet, isn't it also an act of love to leave someone out of your ruin? Or maybe out of fear? Isabel replied without harshness. Perhaps, Clarissa nodded, then added softly, "Has anyone ever told you you have her tone? When you speak, it's dry, but when you listen, it's as if you fine-tune everything you hear." Isabel didn't reply, but she sat down next to him. Daphne Rigby was the only one to leave. One day, she simply didn't come down for breakfast. Frobisher reported that she had left on the first train to London, leaving a brief note. "I was not made for houses where the echo is more eloquent than the people." Nobody stopped her. As for Conrad Hale, his presence in the house became increasingly ghostly. He stopped composing. At night he could be seen walking the halls alone. A week later he too left, taking with him a box of notebooks, some records, and a blank expression. It was Frobisher who, upon closing his room, found a note that said, "Music no longer obeys me." Maybe it never did. One cloudy afternoon, a letter arrived from Belgium. Isabel recognized it immediately. The envelope, the handwriting, the careful margins. It was from Poirot. "Mademoiselle, I've thought a lot about you and your new role as guardian of a legacy that is at the same time a puzzle and a wound. Justice has been served according to the laws of men. But the justice of the soul requires something more. Compassion. You, who knew how to remain silent without hiding and listen without judging, are the only one who can close this score without betraying your spirit. I'm sending you, along with this letter, a reconstructed copy of your uncle's last unfinished work, based on his notes, recordings, and structures. It's yours now. Think of it as a mirror. Your friend always, Hercule Poirot. Accompanying the letter, an impeccably copied score, Suite for an Unexpected Heiress, in F-sharp minor. Isabelle placed it on the music stand in the living room, in front of the piano that had been silent for so long. She sat down, closed her eyes and played the first note. F-sharp. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and it was new. At Lichfield Mansion, for the first time since the death of Alaric Montrose, music was alive again. Epilogue, the note that was never written. 3 months after the events at Lichfield Manor, winter had begun to spread its pall over Brussels, enveloping the cobbled streets with an icy delicacy that Poirot always found pleasing. He sat in his apartment near the Parc de Bruxelles, surrounded by order and silence, accompanied only by the subtle aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the exact clock striking 9 o'clock. On his walnut table lay an unopened letter from a familiar, sender die. Vain the envelope, carefully sealed, was accompanied by a small package wrapped in sheet music paper. Poirot cut the edge with his penknife and extracted the contents. Dear Monsieur Poirot, I know you don't usually accept prolonged gratitude, but allow me at least this brief note. It's been weeks since I returned to playing without fear, not because of my talent, which remains modest, but because I now understand what it means to play something that no longer threatens you with its silence. I've reconstructed my godfather's suite, but I haven't signed it. I feel like it's not completely mine yet. However, I want him to have this copy. It's imperfect, but honest. You'll also find inside something that you, more than anyone, will appreciate. It took me weeks to decide whether to send it. I finally realized that the truth shouldn't be kept as a relic, but rather shared as a lesson. With gratitude, Isabelle. Poirot opened the small package. Inside he found a sheet of music bound in dark leather. Suite for an Unexpected Heiress. Definitive version. On the last page, written in pencil in a corner, a line. Composed by Alaric Montrose, completed by Isabelle Vane, corrected by Life. And next to it, another document, a deteriorated manuscript. It was a confession. Signed by Alaric Montrose, dated just 2 days before his death. He spoke starkly about his fear not of death, but of oblivion. He revealed that he had uncovered Shaw's deception, but also his own emotional manipulations with Clarissa and Conrad. I have created a theatre, he said. I have tuned people like notes. The crime I fear is not that someone will kill me. It is that I may have killed something in them long before. Poirot closed the document, placed it on the table, and stared at the steamed-up window. His reflection, distorted by the damp, seemed to be asking him a question. So, that was all. A final essay that I really enjoyed, he murmured. He got up and put a record on the gramophone. Not the suite, not this time. A simple piece, the Gymnopédie, number 1 by Erik Satie. A melody made of pauses and spaces between notes. As the music flowed, Poirot thought about how the truth rarely comes as a revelation. Sometimes it comes as a note that doesn't fit, like an intentional mistake, like a pause placed in the wrong place, not to spoil the music, but to force you to listen to it differently. With a half-smile, Poirot settled into his armchair. Yes. Sometimes silence speaks more than 1,000 words, and let the music speak for everyone. Chapter 11. The Letter on the Empty Lectern. One unusually mild afternoon for early December, a rural postman was descending the Sussex Hill toward Lichfield Manor, with a single envelope in his bag. It was thick, ivory paper, with slightly frayed edges, as if it had waited weeks to be mailed. There was no return address. Isabel Vane received it with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Since the crime, and everything that followed, the flow of correspondence had been reduced to the bare essentials. But something about the texture of the envelope, and the fact that it was addressed to her in familiar handwriting, made her shudder. He went up to the old music room, the same one where he had returned to practice the suite in F-sharp minor, and there, next to the empty music stand, he broke the seal. Inside was a letter and a folded sheet of music. The letter read, "Mademoiselle, I wasn't the one who killed your godfather, but your music, it did. Alaric died not from poison or betrayal, but from something no one can categorize. The threat of being forgotten. I was merely the hand that struck a note before the silence." C. Isabel dropped the letter. She signed it C with a handwriting that could only be that of Conrad Hale. The accompanying score was brief, a single page titled Fantasy 4, Reverse Time. It began on F-sharp, but descended instead of ascending. Each measure was written in harmonic inversion. The structure was a mirror, not a sequence, as if each note were moving backward toward an impossible origin. Isabel felt something gently crack inside her. Was it a confession? A provocation? An alternative truth? Or perhaps, she thought with horror, a new lie composed with the same talent that had made him capable of manipulating sound and emotion? That night he wrote to Hercule Poirot. "Sir, I received a letter. I can't say it's criminal, but it's certainly disturbing. Mr. Hale hasn't disappeared entirely, and apparently not entirely from the score either. Is it possible for someone to confess not out of guilt, but out of nostalgia, out of self-respect, vanity, or the need to keep playing a note that doesn't exist? Yours always, Ivove." In his Brussels apartment, Poirot read it silently. He didn't smile, but closed his eyes for a long time, as if listening to something only he could hear. Then he wrote 2 lines in his notebook. "The truth was resolved, but music is never completely." And below, without pause, "Perhaps there is no final echo, only a resonance yet unresolved." Chapter 12. The Man Who Disappeared from the Pentagram. That winter grew even quieter at Lichfield Manor. Conrad Hale's letter, received weeks after the crime was solved, had left Isabel with a restlessness that didn't dissipate with the passing of days. Music was no longer just a means of catharsis or remembrance. It had become a puzzle, a spectre that still haunted the rooms and passageways of the house. At 5 o'clock on a windy afternoon, while organizing a new section of the sheet music archive, Isabel heard something impossible. A note in F-sharp echoed in the distance, not in his mind, not from the piano, but from the recording room. The place had been closed since Poirot's departure. No one had touched it. But when she opened the door, she found nothing but the tape reel spinning on its own, as if it had just been activated. The tape had no label. When she stopped it, Isabel saw that it had been replaced with a new one that hadn't been there before. Shaking, he put it back on and let it run. A voice spoke, a clear masculine voice, and alive. "If you're hearing this, Isabel, it's because I decided to. Because there was still one more note I wanted to leave floating in the air. It was the voice of Conrad Hale. I've been in Vienna. No, not hiding. Observing. Trying to compose something. That doesn't sound like me. But I found myself returning to your chords, to their rules, to their shadow. It's impossible. Alaric lives in every phrase I try to forget. So I decided this. I will not compose again. Not until I understand which note I'm missing." Pause. Then one more sentence, loaded with ambiguity. "I've left one last variation. It's hidden where he would never have looked, among the pieces he despised. Find it if you want to know my truth, or destroy it if you prefer to preserve his." Name. Recording stopped with a soft click. Isabel didn't know whether to cry or laugh. For minutes she remained there, motionless. Then she went down to the library and looked for Alaric Montrose's personal catalogue. In the section titled Rejected Fragments, found a subsection labelled as Beginner Exercises, Unnecessary. There, among the scattered sheets, was a handwritten score in handwriting that wasn't Alaric's or his own. It was Conrad's, signed with his initials. The date just a week before the crime. The title, Fugue in G minor on a Stolen Theme. Isabel felt the cold run down her spine. The work was complete. A fugue technically flawless. But something in the progression was erratic, as if there were a code. Analyzing measure 17, he noticed something off. The notes matched the letters of his name, Isabel, converted into musical notation, I, B, S, G, O, a flat, B, B flat, E, E, L, A. A tribute, a warning. At the bottom of the page, in the lower margin, was written in Latin, "And the song of darkness will resound in your heart, and may the song of the shadows resonate in your heart." Isabel stood up slowly. She went to the desk, took out paper and ink, and began to write. This time, not to Poirot, but to herself. Conrad was never the murderer, but he wanted to be the Echo. And now that Echo doesn't ask for justice, but for a score. What if this story isn't over yet? He stopped. What if he never does? Whisper. That night he stored the leak in a closed box, locked it, and labelled it as do not perform until further notice. Then he turned off the lights. He let the house sink into silence, but just before closing the door to the music room, he heard one last note suspended in the air. It wasn't coming from the piano. It came from his memory, and it was in F-sharp. Final. Chapter. The Hidden Chord. A week after the mysterious message from Conrad Hale and the discovery of the fugue in G minor, on a stolen theme, Isabel Vane made a decision. She needed answers. She couldn't remain a passive interpreter in a story that was seemingly still being written. So she wrote a firm letter and addressed it to the only man who could turn music into truth. 3 days later, Hercule Poirot arrived at Brighton Station with an impeccable coat, his leather suitcase, and a face somewhere between expectant and resigned. "Mademoiselle Isabel never calls me out of mere nostalgia," he muttered as he got off the train. No, no, there's something else, something that still rings. He was received at Lichfield with discreet warmth. The atmosphere inside the mansion had changed, still solemn, but now less oppressive. Isabel led him directly to the study, where the score of Conrad's fugue lay on the table next to a copy of Alaric's original catalogue. Poirot watched her intently for minutes. He didn't speak. He just flipped through the music, marked with his finger bar 17, then 24, then 33. Each corresponded to sequences of notes that, when translated, spelled out I-S-O-B-E-L. Very subtle, whispered Poirot. He didn't want to hide the dedication. He wanted you to find it after, but the most important thing is not his name. No, Poirot picked up Alaric Montrose's notebook, the same one in which the composer had written his observations on the house's residents. He opened it to a nearly forgotten page, where a barely scribbled note appeared. Hale betrayed me, not because of what he did, because of what he wrote. His godfather didn't accuse Hale of wanting his fortune, Poirot explained. He accused him of what he considered an even greater sin: imitate him, stealing their style, compromising their musical purity with an imperfect echo. Poirot went to the piano. Let me show you something, mademoiselle. This fugue is based on a play by Alaric that he never published. Fantasy for a Funeral in D minor. Listen to the main theme. He slowly played the opening notes. Now listen to the first of Hale's escape. He played them. They were almost identical, but with a tonal inversion and a subtle key change, barely perceptible to the untrained ear. Poirot lifted his hands from the keyboard. Conrad didn't just pay homage. He wanted to rewrite. And in that act, he killed something more sacred than life to his uncle. Isabel nodded slowly, and the letter, the recorded message, a provocation, a final act of power. He didn't kill Alaric, but by provoking you to believe he was capable of it, he managed to become part of the final act. In the last echo, Poirot walked towards the window. What confirms this for me is a forgotten observation. Alaric despised mirror games, and yet this escape is exactly that. An inverted image. An artistic crime, mademoiselle, but a crime nonetheless. And what do you propose? Nothing legal. There's no punishable crime. But there is truth. You must decide whether this leak should be interpreted or not, whether it should become part of the legacy or be buried with its shadows. Isabel looked at the score one last time. Then, with determined fingers, she slipped it into a black folder. She labelled it, "Not for public performance, for personal study only." Poirot bowed slightly. "A decision worthy of your intelligence and sensitivity." As he left the room, he stopped in front of the portrait of Alaric Montrose in the hallway. He looked at the proud, distant, impenetrable face. "You see, sir," he murmured, "his symphony is over, but like every great work, it left a coda." That night, before leaving, Poirot went to the piano one last time. He played a single note, F sharp, and then nothing.